2. Americans had actually been at war a little more than a year when the Declaration of Independence was signed. The questions now were, could they win the war? And how were they to govern themselves in the meantime? In Williamsburg, the Virginia Convention set to work to draw up a state constitution. James Madison was put on a committee to consider exactly what rights every citizen in Virginia had that could not be taken away by the government or anyone else. Inalienable rights, they were called. At informal gatherings outside the convention, James made friends and felt free to say what he pleased. But never once in the convention itself did he speak out. Still, one of his new friends, Edmund Randolph, reported that James was fantastic at whispering. Indeed, Edmund tried to sit next to him at meetings because James always had interesting comments to whisper in his ear. James was not only quiet, but apparently tried to be inconspicuous as well. He often wore black with buckles at the knees of his breeches and black silk stockings. Later, he would wear nothing but black. Following the fashion of his time, he powdered his hair, dark brown under the powder, and wore it pulled back and tied behind. On his head, he wore a black hat with a cone-shaped crown that was high but didn't seem to make him look taller. One delegate wrote, Madison was probably the only small man at the convention. And of course, he was conscious of his small voice. Even if he dared speak out, how would his voice carry before so many men? Just looking at the famous orator, Patrick Henry, must have made him uneasy. All Mr. Henry had to do was open his mouth, and that mighty voice of his would fill the room and set it quivering. When he wasn't talking, Mr. Henry looked down his long nose at the other delegates as if they were common dirt. Even so, sometimes it was hard for James to keep quiet. He had strong ideas about the questions they were discussing, religion in particular. Nothing made James angrier than to see men punished for their religious views, and they often were. Baptists and Presbyterians were the ones most frequently picked on because they were not members of the Church of England or established church. Only recently, 5 or 6 people in his own part of Virginia had been thrown in jail because of religious opinions that they had expressed. Furious, James wrote to a college friend, I have squabbled and scolded, abused and ridiculed so long about it. I am without common patience. He would never have patience when it came to religious freedom, which was certainly one of the inalienable rights. He was against anyone making laws for the human mind. And again throughout his life, he would fight to see that the state had no hold over a person's religious beliefs or expression. Now, at the Virginia Convention, James found himself objecting to the way the resolution on religion was worded. It stated that all men should enjoy the fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. Toleration! That wasn't enough for James. He couldn't abide such weak wording. So he wrote out his proposed version. All men are equally entitled to enjoy the free exercise of religion. His revision was proved. When James went home in December after the session in Williamsburg had adjourned, he had made up his mind that in the spring he would run for election to the Virginia House of Delegates, the new legislative body of the colony. Of course, where he'd really like to be was in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress was working out problems for the whole country. From what he had heard, he thought they could use some help. James read every newspaper he could lay his hands on. He rejoiced over General Washington's victory at Trenton and again at Princeton. He helped his father round up supplies for the army. And he read. He wanted to understand how governments worked, how some had fallen in the past, some succeeded. The whole question, he decided, turned on where the power lay. In Virginia, he suspected, the people had already made mistakes in their new constitution. So afraid of tyranny, they had given the governor too little power and the House of Delegates too much. In any case, he would soon have the chance to study all this at first hand. He more or less took for granted that he would win the election. After all, he was well known in the county, and people seemed to be impressed by his book learning. Besides, how could he stand on the sidelines of America? He had to win. But he didn't. His opponent, an older man, followed the old Virginia custom of setting out a barrel of whiskey in front of the courthouse and treating the voters as they came to the polls. James thought this was old-fashioned nonsense. He expected people to vote with their heads, with or without whiskey, so he provided no drinks on Election Day. Perhaps the voters had originally intended to vote for James Madison, but if so, they changed their minds. He was either stingy or proud, they decided, and he ought to take up preaching instead of politics. James brooded, but not for long. In the fall, the House of Delegates voted for James to fill a vacancy in the 8-man Council of State, which, with the governor, made up the executive branch of the government. James served for 2 years, and as people came to know him, they discovered his talents. In behind-the-scenes political discussions, James was strong and persuasive, and, as Patrick Henry, who was governor, soon found out, James wrote easily and clearly. Patrick Henry might be able to send his voice to the rafters, but he disliked descending to a desk and dealing with a pen and paper. So he gave James the job of writing up state papers. But the most important thing that happened to James was that he made friends with Thomas Jefferson. The two men had known each other for some time, but they were thrown more closely together when in June 1779, Jefferson was elected governor to succeed Patrick Henry. As a member of the governor's council, Madison discovered not only how well he and Jefferson worked together, but how much they had in common. Tall, red-headed 36-year-old Jefferson and small 28-year-old Madison shared the same vision of a strong, united Republican government. They both liked the same things: reading and collecting books, planting trees, experimenting with science, talking about history, and they agreed on what they didn't like: Great Britain, slavery, the lopsided Virginia Constitution, and Patrick Henry. Neither man could stand Patrick Henry. "What shall we do with him?" James asked once when Patrick was being obstructive in his usual eloquent way. "What we have to do, I think," Jefferson replied, "is devoutly pray for his death." It was a lifelong friendship that Madison and Jefferson established, although they would often have to depend on letters for news of each other. In December 1779, they were separated when James was elected a delegate to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. James went home first and planned to go on from there, but like everyone else in Virginia and throughout the country, he became snowbound. It was the coldest winter of the war. In Morristown, New Jersey, where the army was quartered, the soldiers were running out of food. "The troops, both officers and men," George Washington wrote, "have been almost perishing for want." Of course, had they stopped to think, there were things that everyone could be thankful for. Philadelphia, which had been occupied by the British, was back in American hands and had been for more than a year. The French were fighting on America's side, but in Morristown, the soldiers' stomachs were too empty for them to think of anything but their next meal. And the British Army, it had holed up in nearby New York. James Madison arrived in Philadelphia on March 18, 1780, soon after his 29th birthday. As was fitting for a delegate to the Congress, he brought a servant with him, his slave, Billy, and settled down in a boarding house ready for life in Philadelphia. Jefferson, who had been a delegate to the Continental Congress, would have told him about the city's social life, but still, James may have been surprised at just how lively it was. Indeed, the way Philadelphians entertained, one would have hardly known that the country was at war. Women spent entire afternoons dressing their hair into such towering beehives that when they went out in the evening, they had to scrunch down in their carriages to keep their hairdos from scraping the roofs. Peggy Shippen, the future wife of Benedict Arnold, had to hang her head out of the carriage window. Of course, these stylish hostesses were curious about the young, newly arrived bachelor from Virginia, but one, who invited him to a party, was not impressed. He was a gloomy, stiff creature, she said, with nothing engaging or even bearable about his manners. At first, Madison didn't open his mouth in Congress. He served on committees, worked behind the scenes as he had in Virginia, but at the regular meetings, he simply listened. And he was sickened by what he heard. Although all wanted to win the war, they could not agree on practical measures for governing. They had a hard time even sending the army all it needed to survive. It would be another year before Congress would ratify the Articles of Confederation, the nearest thing the country had to a constitution or law of the land. Not that this would help Madison. In Madison's opinion, the Articles were imbecilic, a firm league of friendship. That's what the Articles claimed to be. But where was the friendship among states that showed more interest in maintaining their own rights than in sacrificing for the common good? The Articles gave Congress no power to force the states to do anything for the central government, and in consequence, they didn't do much of anything. James wrote in disgust to Jefferson that nothing was going as it should. Congress needed more power. It needed better statesmen. It needed permanent solutions, not flimsy patchwork measures, and it certainly needed money. James might be a Virginian, but first and foremost, he was and always would be an American pushing for a genuine union of the states. James held his tongue for 6 months, and then, whether he could be heard or not, he spoke out. His voice was as feeble as it had always been, and indeed, he didn't present much of a figure. This small man with a habit of rocking back and forth on his feet as he warmed to his subject. The delegates might smile. No bigger than half a piece of soap, one observed. They might strain to hear him, but as time went on, they had to agree that James Madison had sound judgment. And as time went on, so did the war. When the British Army moved out of New York in the spring, it moved south, and although there were spurts of good news now and then from the American forces, most of the news was bad. The fall of Charleston, South Carolina in May 1780, that was the worst. Then, a month later, the British decided they would pounce on members of the Virginia House of Delegates, which was holding an emergency meeting in Charlottesville, Virginia. From there, they would climb the hill to Monticello, Jefferson's home. Luckily, the delegates were warned in time, and most, 33 including Patrick Henry, managed to escape. 7 delegates either didn't take the warning seriously or were natural slowpokes. In any case, they were captured. As for Thomas Jefferson, though he sent his family away at the first hint of trouble, he stayed until he had looked through his telescope and had actually seen the redcoats on the streets of Charlottesville. Then he too made his getaway. All this was taking place not more than 30 miles from James Madison's own home in Orange. Since all the great homes in Virginia had names, the Madisons called theirs Montpelier now. Had he known what was happening at the time, James would have been enraged. Already he had heard enough stories of the British Army's cruelty to civilians in Virginia that his hatred of England became so bitter it stayed with him for life. But news traveled slowly, and by the time it reached Philadelphia, James had heard that Montpelier and his friend Thomas Jefferson were safe, and he had himself escaped from a near accident, but not from the British. A bolt of lightning had struck his boarding house, entering the chimney and conducted by a bell ring. It ran through several rooms. Luckily, no one was hurt, but why hadn't they paid attention to Dr. Franklin? They asked themselves. Why hadn't they put up one of his electric rods? In the fall, the attention of the country was suddenly centered on Yorktown, a small Virginia settlement on Chesapeake Bay. The Americans had managed to maneuver the British under the command of General Cornwallis into a corner where, if all went well, the British might be defeated. It might even be a final defeat, that is, if American reinforcements arrived in time to keep the British from escaping by land, and if the French fleet, now in the West Indies, arrived in time to keep the British from escaping by sea. In war, seldom do all ifs work out right, yet the people hoped and feared. In September, reinforcements left Philadelphia for Virginia. James Madison stood in front of the State House with General Washington and other delegates of Congress as 3,000 Continental troops in all kinds of makeshift uniforms paraded past. 2 French divisions followed, smartly dressed, marching with precision. When they reached the State House, they dropped the points of their swords and dipped their colors. In return, the delegates took off their hats. It was a solemn send-off. 6 weeks of suspense lay ahead, charged with rumors, both good and bad. In the end, however, all the ifs did fall in place, and on October 19th, General Cornwallis surrendered. When the news reached Philadelphia, all the members of Congress walked together to the nearby Dutch Lutheran church to give thanks. That night would have been a perfect time to set off firecrackers, and Americans did love an excuse to make a fireworks display. But the weather was too dry. There would have been danger of fire, so instead, the people of Philadelphia set lighted candles in every window in the city. James Madison said he had never been happier. At last, people were beginning to understand James. Yes, he was stiff and awkward, but only when strangers were present. Among those he knew, he was, as one friend observed, charming. Relaxed after a meal with friends, Madison was frank and lively in his conversation, delighting in telling little jokes on himself. Once in Williamsburg, he said, he left his hat on a window ledge and it was stolen. As everyone knew, no gentleman would appear outdoors with his head uncovered, but try as he might, James could not find another hat. For 2 days, he had to stay away from the governor's palace, where the council was meeting. Finally, a Frenchman who sold snuff agreed to sell him something he had. At this point, Madison would start laughing, for it was such a queer-looking affair. That hat, huge, wide-brimmed, with a crown no bigger than a pimple poking up from a field of black. No one who heard the story ever forgot the picture of that enormous hat bouncing down the street to the governor's palace with little Mr. Madison under it. James felt particularly at home with the group of people who lodged in the same house as he did. They liked to tease James about being such a confirmed bachelor, but in the spring of 1783, they decided that perhaps he wasn't so confirmed after all. James was 32 years old now, and he was obviously smitten by pretty 16-year-old Kitty Floyd, daughter of a New York delegate living in the same house. In the evening, when the boarders, including a 19-year-old medical student, gathered in the parlor to hear Kitty Floyd play the harp, James and the medical student were clearly less interested in the music than in Miss Floyd. The fact that James was so much older than Kitty didn't discourage him. Actually, it made him bolder. So he began to court her, then proposed to her, then asked her father for her hand. Since neither Kitty nor her father were against the idea, James and Kitty began planning a November wedding. Joyfully, he wrote Jefferson the news in a code they had developed between them to ensure secrecy. It was a complicated code, like a dictionary with words arranged alphabetically and numbers beside them that would replace words in their correspondence. Since the vocabulary was related largely to politics and business, it was a little difficult for James to talk about love. In code, he said that he had ascertained her sentiments, and the event would take place in the fall. At the end of April, Kitty and her family went home for the summer, and though he hated the separation, James tried to be patient. He couldn't have imagined that he'd be called on for more than patience. But in July, Kitty wrote that she had changed her mind. She felt indifferent to him now and had decided to marry that 19-year-old medical student. She sealed the letter not with sealing wax, but with a piece of rye dough. Maybe this was what was handy, but many have interpreted the rye dough as a deliberate insult. James wrote to Jefferson, and Jefferson, whose wife had died the previous year, sent his sympathy. What James had to do, Jefferson said, was to keep busy. This was the only way to get over such grief. Well, there would be plenty for James to do. 2 months later, in September, the peace treaty with Great Britain was signed and the independence of the United States was formally recognized. And now what? James asked. George Washington described the country as limping along under the Articles of Confederation, moving upon crutches and tottering at every step. How could the country survive like this?